This presentation is one of those types of presentations where you just get to show a lot of stuff, and trying to narrow down trees that you might consider small trees. That's not really hard. It's easy to go through books and online and try to pick trees that fit. And for the purposes of this presentation, 30 foot or less is what we are terming small trees, although a good number of what's on my list today only reaches 20, maybe 25 tops. And I feel like that fits that area of those small spaces or small lots where you don't have, it seems like our lot sizes are getting smaller and smaller these days. And so you need trees that will work like around a patio in this picture or other locations. But before we jump into that list and just kind of run through a handful of these trees, I do want to spend just a minute looking at why do we actually want to plant a tree? And I think a lot of time this gets skipped. I know that I'm guilty of this. I know that some of my master gardeners that I talk to, they just see something at the garden center and they've never seen it before. And so we got to have it, right? And so you may be in that boat as well. I am currently in that boat. I've got quite a few trees I can't put in the ground because it's been so dry in West Kentucky. So I'm still watering all of these things, and I'm not entirely sure where I'm going to put them. So I'm not telling you this from a person who's arrived, who knows how to do this right. I'm more of that mindset of, I don't know how many trees or shrubs or plants are enough, but I know I'm not there yet. You know, you can still always be adding more. But when it comes to trees, because it's probably the biggest cost for plant material and also the longest term investment, over time, I think it's important for us to spend a few minutes and think about why even plant a tree and what its purpose is. As an extension agent, a lot of times I get calls from people who have planted trees in the wrong place. And so the phrase that we tend to kick around is the right tree in the right place. It's really, really tempting when that tree is so small. And let's just take, it's not part of my presentation today, but crepe myrtle, for example. And we take that tree and it's so small in the container and we want it up close to the house. We know we want it to be right on the edge of the house, and we step off about 3 or 4 feet from the corner of the house and it looks great. And it continues to look great until about year 7. And then it's eating up the house. It's covering up your gutters, and we've made a mistake. It's not going to work in that. It wasn't the right tree in that right location. So thinking about how far to step back away from the house before you plant something, that should be a key. This is before you even go to pick out the tree that you're looking for. This is just thinking about why you need a tree in that location. So related to that, I know at my home, I have, again, a tree that doesn't fit this category of small trees, but I have a red maple in the front yard. And that tree is crucial for being able to spend any time in the afternoon on our front porch. Otherwise, it would be blazing sun and super hot and not enjoyable. So keeping that tree in that location provides shade to the front windows in that area. Also, it's a crucial location for a tree. And that can help you decide, well, will a small tree give me the shade that I need for something in a situation like that, or do I need a larger tree? Another thing that people, if you think about landscape design, which I don't tend to think about that often, but what I have read is if you are planting a tree and you have a single story home, okay, then putting a really large tree like a tulip poplar that gets 70 feet easily, right? Probably more in many cases in good sites, in front of a single story house can make your house seem way smaller than what it really is. So it makes more sense to put taller trees that get taller than your home behind it, and trees that stay in this small form, trees that are under that 30, 25 feet height in the front of your house. They look, it looks more unified. It looks better for that. Now, of course, you have a 2-story home. You could put a 45-foot tree in the front yard. It's not going to dwarf it. It's going to be fine. But that's the kind of things that we're thinking through. And then just kind of the basic things that we would always tell you anytime you plant a tree is making sure you look for overhead utilities and underground utilities, and calling 811 and having them come out and mark, even if you're planting a small container, still a good idea, because you don't want to end up planting that right on the top of gas lines or some other lines. And I know around here, especially with our box stores and any new businesses, it seems like, it's probably not intentional, but it seems like Wherever the two telephone poles are and the wire that runs between them, that's where the landscapers want to line up all the trees right underneath those power lines. And we're not talking small trees. We're talking about, big maples and things that's going to eat up the power lines and being an issue later. So always looking for those types of things and getting them in the right proximity to utilities, to your house, to your neighbor's house. And just spending a little bit of time looking at those factors can be very, very helpful. I'm not going to spend much time talking about planting, but I do want to, because we were probably going to see that later this month. I think you'll see that. And you'll probably hear more on these topics as well. But I just wanted to kind of hit the high points here. This is what I would call as after planting care, right? So watering, number one concern that you should have, even in the fall, even if you don't get, the ground is so dry here, I don't imagine I'll be planting before November. And probably the same for you across Kentucky and in many parts of the state. Even though it's really cold, could be really cold in November and into December, if the ground's not frozen, you have to water, and you have to water pretty much weekly to keep that tree going and to give it a healthy start. But a lot of times we stop there. We think, well, I watered the first year and it's on its own. And you can take that approach. But if you want to make sure your tree survives, then you need to continue watering, especially that second year and maybe into 2 years after you've planted that tree. And then anytime we have a hard, extended drought period, that tree is still going to need water. So that's number one. Number two is fertilizer. I know I get that question a lot. If you're buying balled and burlap trees or even container trees and you're going to plant them this fall, you do not need to fertilize this fall or even next season. There's enough fertilizer in those containers that it has all it needs for that first year of growth. Now, next fall of 2023, and it would be a good time to kind of come in and do some fertilizing. And there are some special rates to follow. You don't want to over fertilize. I'm not sure that this picture looks like fertilizer or some sort of a nerd's candy, but that looks like an excessive amount of fertilizer. That's probably not what you need. Mulching, yes, absolutely. Got to mulch. Think about where trees grow. They don't typically, in nature, you don't typically see trees growing out in the middle of a grassy field, right? I mean, you might see a few, but majority of trees are going to grow where there's other trees and the ground is covered in leaves that are breaking down into compost. And so when we take it and we stick it out in a tall fescue lawn or a Bermuda lawn or just a weedy lawn, it's making it really difficult for that tree to get started that first year. So putting a 3 to 4 inch layer of mulch around that tree, not a mulch volcano, but just a nice layer of mulch can help give it a good start. Help regulate the soil temperature, help regulate soil moisture, all good things. Should you prune on a newly planted tree? Probably not necessary. The only thing you should be pruning at that stage is if there were some broken limbs in the transport, you can go ahead and prune those off. If you see an obvious issue, things like dogwoods are really prone to this, and maples are prone to this, where the trunk comes up and then instead of going straight, it does this number. It forks, right? Well, that's a bad idea to leave that. You got to take one of those off, and usually you check the weaker of the two and take that off. Otherwise, you could have a potential later for it to split and rip open the tree, so you don't want that. And that's about it. I would say, as far as staking goes, most of the time we don't need to stake our trees, but if you have a situation where you have a lot of wind, maybe on a slope, then a stake might be a good idea. Staking is temporary. It's one season only, and you drive your stake in the ground. Do not take wire and run it through a garden hose. It's not the best way to do that. It needs to be either like some commercial tie, or I've taken old t-shirts before and ripped them into long strips and wrapped that around the tree and tie it. And that way, if you forget to take it down in a year, it's likely to break down. If it's a cotton t-shirt, it's likely to start breaking down in the sun, and avoid that problem. Another problem that we should really spend some time avoiding is Sunscald. And this is a call we get pretty often. Unfortunately, we don't get it that first year because nobody notices that first year. But what happens on thinner bark trees when they have exposure to the southwest setting sun and during the wintertime is that side of the tree will start to heat up, and those cells will get active again where they were dormant during the wintertime, and they'll get active and they'll call for water and resources from the roots, which are underground and not frozen, but dormant. They're not moving any water to them. So those cells die. and you end up with these large cankers like you see on the screen here on the side of the tree. And sometimes homeowners don't notice that until, a couple of years after they've planted this tree. And then the question is, well, do I have to replace it, or is it going to be okay? It's probably not going to be okay. It's always going to be a weak spot in the tree. I've done it both ways. I've left them and I've taken them out or recommended that they be taken out, but it can be avoided. You can buy these little commercial wraps that are kind of like a plastic base, and you start at the base and you wrap them all the way up. Or you can even use like a fabric, a white fabric. Don't use anything that's dark colored, because that can actually increase the problem, make it heat up more. So you're looking for something white that's more reflective. Some people even mix up paint and paint the trunk of the tree, mix paint with water and give a little coating on the trunk of the tree. To me, that might be a little bit, I don't think it's damaging to the tree at all, but I don't know that I like that look. I like to be able to take that wrapping off in spring, which you should. Don't leave it on just during the wintertime. But if you do the white paint, maybe you like that. And if you do, that's fine. But you see that every once in a while as you drive through towns where even larger trunk trees are painted with that white paint, and maybe they like it. So that's okay too. It's not going to hurt the tree, but if that's not your thing, using one of these tree wraps is probably the best. Okay, so let's start looking at some of the trees. And I narrowed this list down to 12 trees. There's certainly more that are worthy to be planted and that would also fit our parameters of being a small tree. The way that I narrow this down, there are two links that you'll either get in the chat or they were emailed out to you that you should go and take a look at. One of them was put together by Dr. Bill Fountain, and with communication from all the Kentucky nurseries and a lot of extension agents, we looked at, and I was part of that, looking at some of this list of trees. Every tree that's available in the trade, native, non-native tree that's available in the trade in Kentucky is in this list. So it's a big, big list. And they've all been assigned a rating. And their rating is, the higher the rating, 90 to 100% of the top, then the fewer issues that you will have out of that plant. And so what the takeaway message is that anything 60% or above, which is a huge part of those, is a good tree to consider for Kentucky. Anything less than that, you're likely to have some issues. So just before we look at the good ones, let me give you one example of a bad one. So down in the 10% list, right, is ash tree. Ash tree is a great tree and it's a beautiful form and all of that, but it has had to drop way down in that list because of an insect pest that you're familiar with, I'm sure, emerald ash borer in Kentucky, that requires annual treatment, or if you have it commercially done, every couple of years, but a lot of added costs to maintain that tree. That drops to the bottom because we're looking for trees that are tough, that can make it on their own, and that have few issues. So the number one smaller tree that's in that list of 90 to 100% trees is this guy. So this is black gum. Now, as a straight genus species of black gum, it's too tall. You're not going to be able to utilize that tree in a small landscape. But I went ahead and included it here for a couple of reasons. There are some cultivars, and I'll show you one here in just a second. So this is Nyssa savatica. We also call this sour gum or tupelo. Black tupelo is another name. The reason that you might want this tree or one of its cultivars is fall color. And I don't know that you can find a brighter orangey reddish tree for fall color in the landscape. This one is certainly outstanding. And thinking back to that list again, that 90 to 100%, this is the smallest of the trees in that group. Everything else are massive trees. So I went ahead and put this one in because I just kind of give you the example, and I'll show you that cultivar. Also, something else I should mention is that Kentucky does an annual award. It's named for a Kentucky plantsman by the name of Theodore Klein. And so nurseries and extension, or I should say the Hort department and others get together. It's managed right now by Udell Gardens, and they select outstanding trees, shrubs, perennials, and grasses, I think is all. Maybe vines, I guess fits into that. I don't think annuals are included, but all of the woody plants are included. And these are trees that have proven to be excellent for Kentucky. So that's two guidelines you can sort of follow as you're looking for a tree for your landscape. And so I kind of narrowed my list by looking at higher rated species, species ratings, and then whether or not they had some part of that group, whether it was a cultivar or the genus species that's in that Theodore Klein. So the one that, well, let me show you one more picture of the fall leaves. Again, almost a fluorescent, really bright color. But as a straight genus species, probably a little big, 45 feet for most small areas. But consider maybe this guy. So this is Zydeco Twist. What makes it unique is, if you're familiar with Harry Lauder's walking stick, the branches twist and curl, but it still maintains that great fall color. And it's a very small tree. It maxes out at 20 feet. So it's going to fit just about any landscape size. One more note about black gum is that, so this is not the same thing as sweet gum. You don't get the big spiky balls on that. That's a sweet gum tree. Black gum does not have that. In fact, they're not even in the same genus. But what it does have is a fruit that birds love. That's great. If you like birds and you want to attract them into the landscape, that's excellent. You can't, or you shouldn't, plant a black gum over your patio or next to where you park your car, because for parts of the year, it's going to be pretty covered. Zydeco Twist is a male. So it's male and female species, and this is a male, so there is no fruit, and it's a smaller tree. So this has a lot of potential, I think, in the landscape. So that's our number one. If you don't like that one, there's also some weeping forms. So this is autumn cascades. So there's a lot of different options for you to consider. So black gum, number one on my list. Number two, Cornelian, oh, I misspelled it. Cornelian Cherry Dogwood. Not a cherry. This is a dogwood. Cornus mass. Great tree. The reason you should plant this is it's one of our earliest blooming trees. February, at least in West Kentucky, this tree is in full bloom. We have one out front of our extension office. It's a great specimen, full of these yellow flowers. We don't know of any pest in the literature. If you look through, there's no pest that's known for this, where other dogwood species tend to have a lot of pests. This one does not have any. And we've already dropped down. You can see we've dropped out of that 90%, but now we're in the 80 to 90. So it's still at the very top of trees recommended for Kentucky. The 2003 Theodore Klein winner was a cultivar called Golden Glory. And the other reason you might want to grow this, so you have the flowers that are these bright yellow. This is great for those native ground nesting bees that are looking for a pollen source or nectar source first thing early in the spring. As soon as you have a warm day, they can be out feeding on this tree. That's important. They also produce an edible fruit. Well, I say edible. You have to be very hungry to eat this fruit. It's very sour. It's very acidic, but it's very attractive. And so that can be good for birds and those types of things. But this is just an excellent tree, and it's very underutilized. Most people don't even know what a Cornelian cherry dogwood is. But I think it's one that should be used. Sometimes we look, I didn't mention this in why plant trees. Another reason we do that sometimes is to screen a view or screen a neighbor's view of like a pool or whatever. And we tend to think of evergreen trees for that option. But there's not a lot of small evergreen trees that will also do a good job of screening. Now, this is not an evergreen, but it has such a dense set of branches, or can be grown that way, that I think even in the wintertime, it can do a good job of screening. And here's a picture. So here's a picture on the left. This is Cornelian cherry that's been trained into a single trunk and full bloom in February. And then on the right is if you decide to grow it as a multi trunk form. That's how we have ours in front of the office. It looks like a gigantic exclamation point outside. So I think this is one that you should consider. And I have that number 2 on my list. The picture that you're seeing on the left there is Golden Glory, which is basically the standard for Cornelian cherry dogwood. All right, up next. I hesitated putting this one in here. I like the looks of it, but unlike all the other ones in my top list, I don't have any actual experience either planting or growing or just seeing this tree. In fact, if you have one of these, or where there are some in Kentucky, maybe you could share that in the list. But I had to include it because of the rating species. It's near the top. It's as tough as nails. It can take anything you throw at it, except maybe really, really wet soil. Um, and it was a Theodore Klein winner for 2020, so fairly recent, recognized as an excellent tree for Kentucky. And it also shows up on a lot of other award lists. One of them is the Society for Municipal Arborists recommend this as a street tree. So it's taking narrow planting strips, it's taking traffic and pollution and all those things. So everybody loves this tree. I just can't seem to find this tree in the trade or out and about in different locations. It is a little bit slower growing than the others on this list, although there is a cultivar called Starburst that is a little bit faster growing. This is what the bark looks like. So you get this kind of an olive grayish looking bark, and its blooms, I think, look a little bit like bottlebrush buckeye, if you're familiar with that shrub, but these tall panicles of white blooms, and it's compound leaves. So I think it's got a lot of potential in the landscape. It's just one that's obviously underutilized. And as far as we know, not any pest issues for this particular plant either. So one that's maybe a little obscure to one that's I think is definitely my favorite is the Sweet Bay Magnolia. If you like, so most people like to think, when they think about magnolia, they tend to think of the southern magnolia, the great big magnolia with those big thick leaves that lawnmowers cannot mow up. And I don't know that I necessarily love that particular tree. I'm not saying that you shouldn't plant it, although we are on its northern range. But Sweet Bay Magnolia is a native to this area. Its flowers smell a lot different than Southern Magnolia. Southern Magnolia is a very musky smell, and the whole tree is covered in the flowers at one time, where with Sweet Bay, it's more of a lemon scent. I wrote in here that it's a knock your socks off flower. Plant this tree somewhere where the breeze can bring the smell into your home. The other advantage of this tree over Southern is that it tends to bloom sporadically throughout the summer. So it's not one big overwhelming bloom display, but you have them periodically throughout the year. In 2007, it was called a Theodore Klein winner. I think this is an excellent tree. I have this one at my house, and I'm planning to plant a few more of those. What's neat about this tree too is that it's called a semi-evergreen. And I don't know so I guess my definition of semi-evergreen is it's supposed to hang on to its leaves during the winter. But I think the word semi-evergreen means it holds on to most of them. So that's my tree right there that I took a picture of yesterday, sticking the slide set. And in the wintertime, I know it will make it with at least 5 leaves by the time next spring gets here. So it doesn't hang on to all of them. I do think it gets better with age. So the longer you have it in your landscape, the more leaves it may hold. And also how low the temperatures drop tends to impact that, obviously. If it gets down, below 0, you're going to lose a lot more leaves. And that does tend to happen from time to time, right? Cultivars to look for, the standard that you most easily find is one called Henry Hicks. That's that one. There are a few others. There's one called Moon Glow. There's one called Green Shadow. These are what the seed pods look like. They're not as messy to mow around or to clean up like the Southern Magnolia. Again, it sounds like I'm bashing Southern Magnolia. I'm not. I'm just saying I think this might be a better option for most landscape, and certainly for a small space, because the Southern Magnolia is not going to participate with that. One more magnolia that we don't want to miss. This is the Loebner magnolias. So what I want to say about this particular tree is, if you've seen Jane magnolia, which kind of has a pinkish purplish bloom in the spring, but is sort of unreliable. If we have a late freeze, a lot of times those blooms get bit by the frost and turn brown, and you lose your display. And that does happen maybe, I don't know, 2 out of 5 years, it seems like, maybe more. But it's a heck of a show when they make it. Then there's also another one that's more winter hardy called the Star Magnolia. Its blooms aren't as showy. So what has been done here is basically a cross between the Star Magnolia and another one called a Cobus Magnolia. And they came up with this Loebner magnolias. They've been around since the early 1900s. They're underutilized again in Kentucky, but I think that it's certainly worth looking at. And you can see that Merrill and Leonard Messel. So this is the only tree that I think that's right. The only tree that two different cultivars have won Theodore Klein placings. So I think that makes it worth looking at. I got a picture here of their blooms. This one on the left is Leonard Messel, and you can, if you've grown star, you can sort of see that that look to it. The other one on the right here is Merrill, and Merrill's probably the largest blooming forms of these particular magnolias. These are not semi-evergreen and they are not evergreen. They are deciduous. They're going to drop all their leaves. Tough trees. They can plant these just about anywhere, just like the Sweet Bay. I failed to mention that. Sweet Bay and this one, they can tolerate a little bit wetter site and do fine in those locations. All right, up next is Serviceberry, also called the Saskatoon or the Shad Bush. These are a plant. This particular tree is in the genus Amelanchier, but there are several different species of Amelanchier to consider. I would say don't worry about that. Just look at one of the named cultivars that says it's a Serviceberry, because they all do very well. I put this one on here for its 4 seasons of interest. So there's something to see on this tree pretty much year round. And some of it's kind of unique to what we've seen up to this point here. So it has excellent structure, excellent form for the winter. It's smaller again, and it has more of a natural look to it. So not, if you don't want a formal garden or you don't want anything about your garden to be formal, this has a much more open and just natural development to it. It has a great show of white blooms in the spring. Then it sets these fruits that you can see here in the bottom right. So these are edible and they taste great. If you can beat the birds to them, I think you will like them. A lot of people make jams out of them or jellies or things like that. And then the fall color, you can see the leaves are a little bit rounded, have this orangey yellow hue to them. The Theodore Klein winner was Cumulus. Oh, here's another picture of those fruit. Looks a lot like blueberry. It doesn't taste the same as blueberry, but it has a unique flavor, but I think it still tastes pretty good. When I had grown this one at my old house, we would watch for them to get right to this color and then every day check them. And we would get a handful out of the whole tree and the birds got all the rest. It's like they knew when they were about to change and they got them first. Anyway, so they're very good, and they're also good for birds, obviously, if you want to draw in birds. The only pest I've seen on this tree is lacebug. Can cause some damage. They feed on the back sides of those leaves, and that can cause a little bit of damage, not detrimental to the tree. And then sometimes I've seen rust on both the leaves, but especially on the fruit too. Here it is in full bloom. That's Cumulus, kind of like a cumulus cloud, right? Another one's called Autumn Brilliance. There's a lot of other cultivars out there, but if you haven't planted Serviceberry, these are much more available. And if you're just looking for a small tree for next to your patio, I'd say start here. So this one was important for 4 seasons of interest. Plus, it's the first one we've had that's a fruit that's worth eating. But here's a fruit that you might really enjoy, and we've already had a program on this, and I'll show you I'll show you that in the later slide here too. But this is the Paw Paw, Kentucky's only tropical fruit, and it means it's native to here, especially in woodlands and low bottomlands. Typically, it grows up in a thicket. Grows up in a thicket, and if you find them out naturally occurring, they don't tend to set a lot of fruit unless sunlight can get to them. So for us, that's good. We can move this tree out into a more full sun site, and you can get some of these fruit, which are quite unique. And I don't know, I would say it's up to you on the flavor of them. I think that they're a little bit like a banana. Some have said they're a little bit more like a mango. I think that they're good. And I know the ice cream that you can make out of these are really, really good, but not everybody loves them. Still, it's worth trying, I think. These trees have male and females, but they're a little bit more complicated than that. And you should watch the video about Paw Paw to learn if you need to plant more than one, which you probably do, unless you want to hand pollinate it. They have male and female flowers, and so they don't necessarily self-pollinate. But if you want to get to the fruit there, the leaves are pretty awesome. Big leaves, great compound leaves here, and the fall color on these are excellent also. They have a little purple flower that could be missed in early summer, late spring, but one more feature for that particular tree to consider. This is the website for information about pawpaws. And Sherry Crabtree, who was with us this season, earlier in the season, I think, did the presentation on growing pawpaws. So I'd encourage you to go to the website at Kentucky Hort News and check out that video if you want to learn more about growing pawpaw trees. Probably the only tree in this little presentation here that has its own fact sheets from Kentucky, and that's the form of it over there. I think it's an excellent tree. Again, it's a Theodore Klein winner, and if you've got and these aren't massive fruit trees, right? So these are 20-foot at the most, but that goes back into that edible landscaping idea, adding things like serviceberries and pawpaws into the landscape that not only provide beauty and color, but also fruit that you can go out and eat. And I don't think you have to race the birds to get to this one. This next one is Chinese fringe tree, Chinensis. And my experience with this one is there's one street here where I live that homeowner has a really excellent specimen, and I just love going by there in the spring and seeing this thing in bloom. It's outstanding. You can see the blooms are almost feathery, and the entire tree can be covered that way, and it lasts for a very long time. It's in the top 70 to 80. It's a 2010 Theodore Klein winner. I might point out this is the Chinese fringe tree versus the native fringe tree. So we do have one that's native to the U.S. in this part of the U.S., and it is equally nice as far as a tree goes, but it doesn't tend to have the flower show that the Chinese fringe tree has, and I think that's why it made it to that top list. It also has a kind of a bluish looking fruit that the birds will eat, and it's an excellent addition to that tree. Been around in the U.S. for a long time. I think the oldest is about 100 years old over at Arnold Arboretum, and this is what you can just expect to get out of this tree, just branch after branch covered in those white feathery blooms. I think that's an excellent choice too. Japanese tree lilac. So this is an excellent, we've had this one here at the extension office out front before. The reason that you should consider planting this one is the summer blooms. So many of the trees that flower tend to do so in the spring. And here's something that can take the heat, take a dry site, take an unpleasant location, and set these flowers in the summer and just do excellent. Now, I know what you're thinking, because this is what I was thinking too. Does it smell as good as a regular lilac? It has a smell, but that's about all we can say about that. It's not very, very fragrant like the lilacs go. But it is a very pretty tree. Here it is standing out in the landscape. Its bark is also very nice. Tough tree, kind of a medium growing on its how fast it can grow. It's not a super fast grower, but just a great little garden tree, and I think another one to consider. All right, it would be hard not to include redbud in this list, even though you may feel like, oh, redbud, it's so common, we can't plant redbuds anymore. You need a redbud because that means it's spring, right? And they're native to this area. The Cyrus canadensis ones anyways are. But you can see we've kind of dropped down in our rating species. Now we're down in that 60 to 70% rating. And the primary reason for that are the issues that it gets, like cankers. That can be a little bit of a risk. I know I had a conversation with one of our nursery growers just yesterday, actually, about this tree. And I was asking how long he expected redbud trees to last in the landscape. And he feels like that they last longer, but I would give it 25 to 30 good years in the landscape. So think of this more as like a perennial tree. But certain cultivars have been showing to do a lot better. There are white forms that have white flowers on them, and those seem to last a little better. And then one of our Theodore Klein winners, the Appalachian Red, stand corrected, there's actually two redbuds as well as that made the Theodore Klein list. We have that one here at the office. People still ask about that one because of how bright the blooms are. I don't know if this picture does it justice, but I took that in front of our extension office a few years back. It's way bigger than this now. But the color of those blooms, it's not that pale lavender color that you see when you drive down the parkways and such around Kentucky. This is a deep, rich red color. So certainly one that you should consider. And then silver cloud has a variegated foliage, and that's nothing else. There's been so much breeding done with redbuds. There's something for everybody in here. We got different forms like weeping forms. We've got certain cultivars that are green, that are purple, that are variegated like the silver cloud, even gold foliage. There's a lot of different varieties. So try some of the redbuds. And by the way, if you didn't know, you can actually eat the flowers off a redbud. Or I wouldn't just make a whole meal out of it, but you could decorate with it on a salad or something and eat those. All right, and then nearing the end here, crabapple. I know that crabapple's been around forever, and I know that some people will say I never would plant a crabapple because they get so disease ridden, and that's true. There's probably, I would say, more than 1,000 different cultivars have been released of crabapple trees. And early on, they were only breeding those for the flower show, and they didn't do much about the diseases. And it gets all kinds of diseases. It gets fire blight, it gets rust, it gets frog eye leaf spot. It gets a lot of problems, right? But in more recent years, they've put a lot more effort into reducing the amount of disease to the point that there are many crab apples now that not only have a great show like you see on the bottom here, but they also don't have any disease issues. That's what you need to look for. Crabapple does have a fruit. Typically, the breakdown there between crabapple and an apple is that if it's less than 2 inches in diameter, then it's in the crabapple group. I don't know if that's a firm rule, but that's what you see. And most people would say, yeah, but also the flavor is very tart. Well, that's true, but some of the cultivars have actually very, very good flavors of crab apples too. One that we actually have two out front of our entrance are the Donald Wymans, which look like a gigantic cloud, like you see in that picture. That's not Donald Wyman, but it's even more floriferous than that tree. It's just total white ball in the spring of the year. So if you thought about crabapple in the past and you're like, no, I don't want that, I want big fruit. You don't have to have big fruit. Oh, I don't want all the diseases. They don't have diseases anymore. The majority of the newer cultivars don't have diseases. So look at it again. Plus, you don't have to be stuck with just the white bloom. And so many of our spring ones are. You got pink blooms, you got purple blooms, you got different forms, like upright forms. Take a look at crabapples. There's a lot of good ones out there. All right, the last one on our list, Chinese dogwood. So don't get upset with me that I did not put the flowering dogwood, the native flowering dogwood. There's a good reason for that. At least where I'm at, we tend to see a lot of decline in our native flowering dogwood. I don't know if it's the temperature changes, if it's the sites where people try to plant these, because it's not, the soil isn't exactly native soil. If they try to give them too much light and they tend to burn and the leaves get all crispy, there's some disease issues and borer issues. So there's a lot of things to be aware of with flowering dogwood. Now, there are some that are resistant to disease. I should add that in there. And there's some great ones still being produced. So don't just abandon our flowering dogwood, but probably almost the perfect tree is the Chinese dogwood or Cornuscusa. Almost, because it does need a little bit of protection late in the day. If you can put it in a site where it gets a little afternoon shade, it'll do a lot better for you. But there's been two listed here, green sleeves and wolf eyes, that are excellent cultivars, but there's just so many, and I would recommend that you look at that. The Chinese dogwood does not have any trouble with anthracnose that we tend to get on flowering. Neither does it have any issues with powdery mildew. Its fruit has these weird spiky red balls, and they're edible and they're really good too. We have one out front and I have one at home, and you can bust that fruit open. They're not quite ripe yet. They should be ripe pretty close. They're bright red, but they're still a little hard. But you bust those open and you can eat the pulp out of the inside, and it's really, really, really sweet. So there's another reason to consider that. Here's green sleeves on the left, and you can see those layers. One thing that's different between Cornuscusa and the flowering dogwood is that these flower after the leaves appear, where our flowering dogwood, our native dogwood flowers before the leaves appear. So you do have that. But there's another variegated form. This is the wolf eyes here. And there's some others, there's many others that you could look at too. Lots of variegation. Summer Fun is another, but these are trees that only get about 15 feet tall. So I think they can work in a lot of different situations. So I threw a lot at you. Let me get to our last slide here. Here we go. I want to point out a couple of references for you. So this is a great book. It's called Landscaping with Trees in the Midwest. This is a good one, not just for small trees, but it has a breakdown. Can everybody see that okay? It has a breakdown of what the tree in different times of the year, as well as its height and care. Probably not one you're going to rush out and grab, but maybe your county agent might have this. Is the Tree Book by Dr. Durr. And it has way more information in it, probably than you need. But also the two links that you'll get today, the links to the Theodore Klein list and the links to just how those trees perform. I think that can help you in making a decision. And I think I want to end with this point here. While this presentation is about smaller trees for smaller spaces, if you have opportunity to plant bigger trees, don't get the mindset of, and I hear this all the time, well, I'm only going to be around for 30 more years, so I want to be able to enjoy it. We need people planting trees that maybe aren't as fast growing, that maybe get much bigger, but it might take a long time. And I think we're seeing that just from my personal experience, that people not planting enough of these slower growing trees like white oaks and those type. So if you have an opportunity to set one out, even though you may never enjoy it, because it might take 50 years for a thing to get of any size, just think about in the future. And I try to tell that to my master gardeners and others too. So with that, thanks for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Sharon.